He sat there, calm as always. A man in his 90s, with glasses perched low on his nose and a voice that barely rises. But when Warren Buffett speaks, the world leans in. This time, however, something was different. There was a sharpness in his tone, a deliberate pause between his words. It wasn't about a stock pick, it wasn't about a new investment strategy. It was a warning, and not just any warning, his last, perhaps. A message he wanted everyone to hear. But most people missed it. The video clip was short, buried in a long Q&A, just a few minutes. Yet what he said shook the ground beneath the financial world. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't laughing with Charlie Munger. He looked tired, concerned, but above all, urgent. Like a grandfather who sees a storm coming and knows the younger generation won't believe it until it's too late. Most people think Buffett's wisdom is only about money, stocks, bonds, the S&P 500. But this message was different. It wasn't about how to make more money. It was about what happens when you trust the wrong systems, when the economy becomes a game of illusion, when the foundations that once held everything together begin to crack and no one notices, until the collapse is irreversible. Imagine hearing a fire alarm in a crowded room, but nobody reacts. People keep laughing, sipping coffee, scrolling their phones. That's what Buffett's warning felt like, a soft alarm that most dismissed. But what if he's right? What if the smoke is already here, and we've been breathing it for years, too numb to notice? What if the markets, the banks, even our trust in governments is more fragile than we ever imagined? Warren Buffett didn't scream. He doesn't need to. That's the terrifying part. His calmness made the warning even more chilling. Because when someone like Buffett, who has spent 8 decades studying human behavior through the lens of finance, looks worried, you pay attention. Not just with your ears, but with your gut. This is about being rich or poor. This isn't even about investing. It's about the systems we depend on every day, the ones we assume are stable. Buffett's words weren't aimed at Wall Street insiders. They were meant for everyone. For you. For the average person who thinks everything will just work out. Because that's what we've been taught. Trust the system. Play by the rules. Save. Invest. Retire. But what happens when the system itself is broken? There's a reason Warren Buffett is called the Oracle of Omaha. Not because he predicts the future, but because he sees the present more clearly than anyone else. And what he sees now is deeply unsettling. This is the story of that warning, a quiet storm hidden in plain sight. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. He began with a single phrase that seemed almost too simple to matter. People don't learn from history. At first, it sounded like one of those Buffettisms, the kind of line he delivers at every annual meeting, seasoned with wit and wisdom. But this time, there was no smile on his face, no levity, only a slow, almost painful pause, as if the weight of what he was about to say was pulling him down. And when they don't, they suffer. That silence afterward, it wasn't empty. It was loaded with meaning. It was a moment that passed like thunder, quiet but devastating. Warren Buffett wasn't talking about a market crash. He was talking about something deeper, the collective blindness that creeps in during times of false stability. The same blindness that allowed bubbles to inflate in 2000. The same complacency that led to the housing crisis of 2008. And the same arrogance that is, according to him, quietly spreading again. But this time, it's bigger, more systemic, and disturbingly silent. He referenced the growing size of government deficits, the addiction to printing money, and the illusion of control that modern economies cling to. It works, he said, until it doesn't. People in the room didn't flinch. They laughed, nodded, some even clapped. But if you looked closely, Buffett's face didn't change. He wasn't performing. He was confessing. Because he knows how cycles work. He's seen every phase of the market: euphoria, denial, collapse, recovery. But now he sees something different, a complete detachment from reality. A marketplace floating not on fundamentals, but on faith. Faith in central banks, faith in tech giants, faith in numbers that no longer reflect the real economy. Buffett spoke of how money has lost its meaning, how we've replaced value with velocity. Stocks rise not because companies innovate, but because narratives are crafted. Hype becomes profit, speculation becomes strategy. And the average investor, hungry, hopeful, is led into a game where the rules are invisible and the referees are silent. People think this time is different, he said, that the old rules don't apply. But gravity doesn't go away just because you stop believing in it. He mentioned the younger generation, how they are being raised in an environment where risk is disguised as opportunity, where losses are gamified and financial responsibility is buried under influencer slogans. They're not learning about money, Buffett warned. They're learning about dopamine. A pause, a glance downward, and then, softly, and they'll pay for it. You could hear the paper shuffle, the air conditioner hum, but not much else. Because no one wanted to interrupt that moment. No one dared. Because deep down, everyone felt it. That creeping anxiety that maybe, just maybe, we're standing on ground that isn't as solid as we thought. That maybe the economy we're so proud of is running on momentum, not strength. On borrowed time. On borrowed money. He didn't name names, but his message was clear. There are institutions that are too big to fail until they fail. There are markets that seem unstoppable until they stop. And there are people who believe they are safe until safety becomes the mask. Most dangerous illusion of all. Warren Buffett isn't emotional. He's rational, coldly logical. So when he says things like, "The fuse has been lit," you don't take it as panic. You take it as prophecy. Because he's not trying to scare you, he's trying to wake you. And maybe that's the tragedy of it all. That a man who has seen more financial cycles than most of us have birthdays is standing in front of us, quietly pleading, and the world is too distracted to listen. We scroll past, we clip quotes, we move on. But the truth remains, the warning stands, and the clock is still ticking. He leaned back slightly in his chair, hands folded, a posture of reflection, not defense. The crowd waited for another clever remark, another quotable moment. But instead, Buffett asked a question, one that didn't seem directed at anyone in particular. What happens when trust evaporates? At first, it felt rhetorical, but then he repeated it. What happens when people stop believing? His voice was soft, low, but there was something in the way he said believing, as if he wasn't talking about just economics anymore. He was talking about faith, not religious, but structural, the kind of belief that holds societies together. For decades, Buffett has stood as a symbol of calm in turbulent times. But this time, he wasn't promising recovery. He wasn't even discussing solutions. He was diagnosing a sickness, one we refuse to admit. A slow erosion of trust in banks, in governments, in currencies, and even in each other. It begins small. A financial institution manipulates numbers. A government prints money without explanation. A corporation reports inflated growth. And then one day, a regular person wakes up, checks their account, and it all feels unreal, like it could vanish and no one would be accountable. Buffett spoke of 1929, not as a historian, but as someone who has studied it with forensic intensity. He described how ordinary people didn't panic because of the crash itself. They panicked when they realized no one really knew what was happening, when even the experts looked confused. That moment of mass uncertainty, That's when fear turns to chaos. And the terrifying part is, it doesn't start with a bang, it starts with silence, with data that doesn't make sense, with reassurances that sound hollow, with confidence that feels rehearsed. Then he looked out at the audience, not dramatically, just a quiet gaze. "We're building towers without checking the foundation," he said, "and we're praising the height while ignoring the cracks." The applause that usually followed his insights didn't come immediately. People were still processing, because this wasn't the Buffett of investor optimism. This was the Buffett who sees beneath the surface and doesn't like what he finds. He pointed to the rising household debt, the speculative housing market, the over-leveraged institutions hiding behind complex algorithms. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered, it was the psychology behind them. The why. Why do people keep spending money they don't have? Why do companies take risks they can't afford? Why do governments act as if tomorrow won't come? The answer, according to him, is terrifyingly simple. Because it has worked. So far. But so far isn't forever. It's a trap, a lull, a false sense of immunity. And when the reckoning comes, it won't be about money. It will be about belief. About waking up and realizing the rules have changed overnight, and no one told you. He described it like a magician's trick. While everyone watches the left hand, the real danger happens in the right. And by the time the curtain drops, the illusion has already cost you everything. There was a moment when he mentioned inflation, not the kind that makes headlines, but the quiet inflation that steals from the poor while rewarding the rich. The kind that doesn't show up in official charts, but is felt at the grocery store, at the gas pump, in the lives of people who wonder why their paycheck no longer stretches. It's the most silent form of theft, he said, and it's happening every day. Not with gunshots or headlines, but with percentages and silence. And then came a line that didn't sound like Buffett at all. If you wait for the storm to start running, you're already too late. It wasn't advice, it was regret. A reflection of how most people only act once the damage is visible, once the panic sets in, once trust has already been broken beyond repair. Buffett isn't dramatic. That's what makes his warnings so disturbing. He doesn't need to exaggerate. The numbers speak, the patterns repeat, the silence grows. And beneath the calm exterior of the market lies a storm that's been building for years, not from greed alone, but from denial, from an unwillingness to face hard truths, from a collective decision to believe that consequences are optional. The cameras kept rolling, the audience remained still, but behind the scenes you could almost hear the echoes of history. Crashes don't announce themselves. Collapses don't begin with chaos. They begin with disbelief. And then, all at once, the world changes. The room grew colder, not because the temperature changed, but because the atmosphere had shifted. Warren Buffett wasn't offering predictions anymore. He was revealing patterns, like a man who's read the same tragic novel 100 times and knows exactly how it ends. Everyone is looking for signals, he said, but they're ignoring the silence. There was a pause. The silence is the signal. That line hung in the air like smoke. Because he wasn't just referring to economic indicators, he was referring to the absence of questioning, the absence of caution, the absence of fear when fear is justified. For decades, Buffett taught people to invest for the long term, to avoid panic, to trust in value and patience. But now, the patience he once praised is being tested in a new way, not by volatility, but by artificial calm. The kind of eerie stillness that comes before a crash. Markets hitting all-time highs, even as layoffs rise. Corporate profits booming, even as consumer credit debt explodes. A system that keeps telling you everything is fine when the numbers behind it whisper otherwise. He didn't point fingers, he never does, but he made something clear. The architecture of modern finance has changed. and not necessarily for the better. Algorithms now run trades at speeds no human can follow. Markets are manipulated not just by traders, but by narratives spun online, boosted by influencers, swallowed by the masses. And the illusion of control? It's just that, an illusion. "We've built a house of glass," Buffett said, "and people are dancing inside with blindfolds on." He spoke of leverage, not just in financial terms, but psychological ones. The way people borrow against future certainty, buying homes they can't afford, investing money they don't have, chasing returns with a kind of desperation masked as ambition. "We've replaced discipline with desire," he said, "and desire doesn't calculate risk, it only chases reward." It was a painful truth, especially coming from a man who made his fortune by avoiding hype and resisting temptation. Then he did something unusual. He pulled out a sheet of paper. On it were numbers, handwritten, slightly faded. It was an old balance sheet from decades ago, from a time when companies were small, slow, and humble. He held it up and said, "This is what value used to look like." And then, after a pause, "Now ask yourself, what does it look like today?" The question was meant to sting, because the answer wasn't about numbers. It was about meaning, about how modern markets have lost their grounding in reality. He spoke about history again, about the dot-com bubble, about Enron, about Lehman Brothers. They all had one thing in common, he said. People knew something was wrong, but they didn't want it to end. That's the most dangerous phase of any crisis. Cycle. The denial. When the signs are there, but the momentum is too strong, the profits too sweet, the collective will too blind to stop. It's like watching someone fall in slow motion, he said. You can scream, but they're already mid-air. There was no urgency in his voice, no theatrics. That's what made it so disturbing. Because Buffett doesn't speak in fear. He speaks in patterns, in probabilities. And when he says things like, "We've overextended every lever we have," it's not a guess. It's a diagnosis. And the medicine, he implied, would not be painless. He made an observation about the Federal Reserve, how its tools are becoming less effective, how rate changes no longer produce the same impact, how printing money has become the default solution to every problem. It's like using painkillers for a broken leg, he said. You can't feel the pain, but the bone's still broken. And when the pain comes back, it comes back worse. Buffett didn't dwell on catastrophe. He never does. But he painted a picture, quietly, with words chosen carefully. A society addicted to optimism, a market that punishes caution, a culture that sees every dip as a buying opportunity, never a warning. When the tide goes out, he reminded the room, you see who's been swimming naked. It's one of his most famous quotes, but this time it didn't feel like a clever line. It felt like a prophecy. And the most haunting part? He wasn't speaking to billionaires or hedge fund managers. He was speaking to regular people. Teachers, nurses, parents, young investors chasing freedom. People who don't have safety nets, who believe in the system because they've been told to, and who may never recover if the system turns against them. Because collapses don't care about dreams. They don't wait for perfect timing. They arrive uninvited, and when they do, they leave no room for do-overs. He spoke slowly now, as if measuring each word, not just for accuracy, but for weight. There's something I've learned, Buffett said, after watching generations try to outsmart the system. The system doesn't care who you are. It was a chilling sentence, not because it was cynical, but because it was true. The market doesn't reward intention. It doesn't respond to emotion. It simply reacts. And when the system breaks, it doesn't discriminate. That's the part most people forget. He reflected on 2008, not the headlines, but the quiet devastation that followed. Families losing homes, retirements erased overnight, trust shattered in a single breath. That wasn't a financial crisis, he said. It was a trust crisis. And once trust disappears, the rebuilding doesn't happen in numbers. It happens in hearts. And that process is much, much slower. Now, once again, he sees the same storm clouds, but this time they're wrapped in something more dangerous: overconfidence. Everyone thinks they're smarter now. They have apps, charts, AI. People think technology protects them, Buffett warned. But technology doesn't prevent collapses, it just accelerates them. We've built tools that move money faster than ever, but understanding hasn't caught up. Information flows in seconds, but wisdom takes decades. He gestured to the younger generation again, those who entered adulthood during bull markets, who have never known real financial pain. They live in a world of credit cards, crypto, and quick trades, a world where risk is aesthetic and losses are content. But real financial collapse? That isn't entertainment, it's survival. It's waking up one day and realizing your savings don't matter, your home is underwater, your future has been mortgaged to yesterday's decisions. Buffett's final warning came like a whisper, not a shout. We've stopped asking the right questions, he said. And when you stop asking, you stop preparing. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. Because preparation isn't about doom, it's about humility. It's the quiet understanding that nothing is too big to fail, that no bull market lasts forever, that the people who survive the fall are the ones who never believed they were immune to it. Then he leaned back, took a breath, and said, "I'm not saying this to scare anyone. I'm saying this because no one else will." And in that moment, you could feel it, not fear, but clarity. A silence that wasn't empty, but full of unspoken understanding. Because when someone who has watched the economy for 80 years tells you the machine is overheating, you don't need fireworks to believe him. You just need to listen. If you've come this far, you already know this wasn't just a story about Warren Buffett. This was a mirror, a reflection of a system that's pushing forward on momentum and hope when what we need most is caution, clarity, and courage. Buffett's last warning isn't written in headlines, it's hidden between the lines, and now it's in your hands. What you do with it, that's up to you. If this message resonated with you, if you felt the weight of these words and the truth behind them, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel because we're not afraid to dive deeper into what others barely touch. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, your concerns, your reflections. Let's start the conversations that matter. And if you found this important, click like, not for us, but so more people can hear what needs to be heard. This isn't the kind of video you forget. It's the kind you come back to when the silence finally breaks.